Yes, I want to thank my friend from Kentucky and ask him if he would to yield for a question without losing his right to the floor. And I want to start out just by prefacing this for a few minutes. From my limited experience just over the past little over 2 years on the Intelligence Committee now, I want to start by saying that there's simply no question that our nation's intelligence professionals are incredibly dedicated, patriotic men and women who make real sacrifices to keep our country safe and free. And in that, they should be able to do their jobs secure in the knowledge that their agencies have the confidence of the American people. And Congress, those of us here, need to preserve the ability of those agencies to collect information that is truly necessary to guard against real threats to our national security. The framers of the Constitution, as my colleague from Kentucky knows, declared that government officials had no power to seize the records of individual Americans without evidence of wrongdoing. And it was so important that they literally enshrined and embedded this principle in the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution. In my view, the bulk collection of Americans' private telephone records by the NSA in this program clearly violates the spirit, if not the letter, of the framers' intentions here. You know, just 6 months after my first Senate intelligence briefing, former National Security Agency contractor Edward Snowden leaked documents that exposed the NSA's massive collection of American cell phone and internet data. And as my friend from Kentucky said, not just a few Americans, literally millions of innocent Americans caught up in what is effectively a dragnet program. And it was made clear to the public that the government had convinced the FISA court to accept a sweeping reinterpretation of Section 215 of the Patriot Act, which ignited, in my view, a very necessary and long overdue public conversation about the trade-offs made by our government between protecting our nation and respecting our constitutional liberties. I think that well-intentioned leaders had, during the previous decade, come down decidedly on the side of national security with a willingness to sacrifice privacy protections in the process. And what became obvious was that because of our continued lack of knowledge of al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations, some within our government believed that we still needed to collect every scrap of information available in order to ensure that should we ever need it, we could query this information and track down U.S.-based threats. In doing so, the government ended up collecting billions of call data records, linked in case after case after case, not to terrorists, but linked to innocent Americans. Wisconsin Republican Congressman Jim Sensenbrenner, who I served with in the House of Representatives, who was one of the authors of the original underlying legislation, the Patriot Act itself, said a couple of years ago, the Patriot Act would never would have passed had there been any inclination at all that it would have authorized bulk collections, end quote. As this debate increasingly moved to the public sphere, I joined my colleagues on the Intelligence Committee, Senator Wyden, who was just here on the floor a few minutes ago, and former Senator Mark Udall, in pressing the NSA and the Director of National Intelligence for some clear examples in which the bulk information collected under this metadata program, under Section 215, was uniquely responsible for the capture of a terrorist or the thwarting of a terrorist plot. They could not provide any, not a single solitary example. Nor could they make a case for why the government had to hold this data for so long and why it had to hold the data itself and for so long. Thankfully, a review panel set up by President Obama agreed with us and recommended that the government end its bulk collection of telephone metadata. I'll admit, however, and my friend from Kentucky has brought this up on several occasions already, that I am incredibly disappointed that the President hasn't simply used his existing authority to unilaterally roll back some of the unnecessary blanket metadata collection. Some have claimed that this inaction is evidence that the President secretly supports maintaining the current program as is. That, however, is nonsense. The President has asked Congress to give him additional authorities so that he can carry out the program in an effective manner, and the USA Freedom Act seeks to do just that. Now, the Republican-led House of Representatives last week passed that bill, the USA Freedom Act, by a vote of 338 to 88, with large majorities from both parties. At a time when everyone believes we agree on nothing, large majorities of Republicans and Democrats supported that legislation. And further, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals ruling that the NSA is violating the law by collecting millions of Americans' phone records is even more proof that we've gone too far and need to recalibrate and, in my view, refocus our efforts. Why on earth, I would ask you, why on earth would we extend a law that this court has found to be illegal? Now, given the overwhelming evidence that the current bulk collection program is not only unnecessary, but also illegal, I think we've reached a critical turning point. And I want to thank my colleague from Kentucky for coming to the floor to force us all to have this conversation. We've kicked the can down the road too many times on this particular issue, and I believe it's time to finally end the bulk collection of these phone records and instead focus more narrowly on the records of actual terrorists. Americans value their independence. I know this is especially true in my home state of New Mexico, and they cherish their right to privacy that is guaranteed by our Constitution. But some of our colleagues still think it's okay for the government to collect and hold millions of private records from innocent citizens and to search those records at will. The majority leader is asking us to act quickly to reauthorize. I believe it would be a grave mistake to reauthorize the existing Patriot Act. And I join my colleagues in blocking any extension of the law that does not include major reforms, including an end to bulk collection. I think we can and we must balance government's need to keep our nation safe with its sacred duty to protect our constitutionally guaranteed liberties. And I guess this brings me to my question for the gentleman from Kentucky. How on earth can you possibly square what the Fourth Amendment says in terms of our papers and our ability to control our own effects without a warrant with the government's bulk collection of phone records of law-abiding American citizens?
For that great question. I think there's no way that we can square this bulk collection with the Fourth Amendment. I think part of the problem, though, is that we, over a long period of time, diminish the protections of records held by third parties. And I think one of the debates that we need to get, hopefully, to the Supreme Court sometime soon is, do you give up your privacy interest in records that are held by third parties? Because I think there will come a time that your papers that were once held in your house, there are no papers in your house. There may not be paper, but there's still the concept of records. And records were traditionally on paper and they were traditionally in your house. But now your most private papers are held digitally by your phone, and then by the people who are in charge of the different organizations, such as phone, email, et cetera. And I think that there has to be Fourth Amendment protection of these. And those who look at the court cases and go back to probably the last important case, the Maryland versus Smith case, they often say there is no Fourth Amendment protection at all for these records. In fact, the government will tell you they can do whatever they want with email, with text, with all of these things. And I'm not convinced that they're not using other programs, such as this executive order program, to actually collect many other kinds of metadata other than phone calls. So I'm very worried about it. I think we need help from the courts, but we need help from the legislative body to represent the will of the people. And I think the will of the people is very clear that the majority of people think we've gone too far and that we need to stop this indiscriminate vacuuming up of all Americans' phone records, regardless of whether there's suspicion.
I would ask the gentleman from Kentucky an additional question, and I found it very helpful before I came down here today. And I want to thank you again for raising these critical issues. I went back and I read the Fourth Amendment, and I thought it'd be worthwhile just to briefly read that once again here on the floor, because I think it really puts you in the mind of some of the greatest Americans that ever lived. Our framers wrote a Constitution that has survived for well over 200 years now. It has survived Republicans, it has survived Democrats, it has survived political parties that came and went, and it has survived great conflicts time and time again. It says the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, shall not. And no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. And I would ask my friend from Kentucky his views on the resilience of this constitutional document and how you can possibly read the actual text of this Fourth Amendment without realizing that those framers really meant for this to apply into the future to things that we hadn't foreseen yet, using the broadest terminology available in using words like effects and papers. And I would yield back, and I just want to thank the gentleman from Kentucky once again. This is one of those issues that unites people on the left and the right, Republicans and Democrats, who care deeply about our national security, but also care about our constitutional liberties. And I think the time to fix this is upon us. And without shining a light on this, we certainly are not going to be able to make the progress that we need. We have an opportunity here, and we should seize it. And I yield back to him.